Conas T, how are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelit Tales podcast, where we tell Irish myths set to original music. My name is Sorcha, and I'm one half of the sibling storytelling duo who founded Candlelit Tales. This episode continues the saga of the Fianna, and more specifically, it continues and concludes the story of the birth of Diarmuid. So if you missed last week's episode, you might want to go back and listen to that first. This one's told by my brother Aaron. To listen to our reflections and chats and support this podcast, you can join our Candlelit crew by following the links in the description or the show notes or the bio, depending on where you're listening to this. But for now, hey Aaron, tell us a story.
They had agreed it was wise if he went to Don. Don was the father of Diarmuid. He was a wise and a strong, a very well-spoken member of the Fianna, and perhaps Rock could ask him to foster his child as he was caring for Don's. It made perfect sense. And after all, Rock didn't know the mortal ways as well as Don, and, well, Don didn't know anything of the other world, and so it was a good exchange, at least. Perhaps he would meet this man and see eye to eye. After all, they both shared the affection and the taste of taking Cruthnid to bed. Although it didn't work out for Don, Rock was sure they would be amicable and respectful and treat each other as brothers. But when he came to Almoon, there was no Fionn McCool to be found. He was out hunting. He searched and found Don shortly after, and in front of many of the warriors of the Fianna, it was clear that tensions were not quite right between them. Rock attempted to appease and ease tensions by humbly offering his services to Don if there was any need for him to call on him. But Don simply asked what it was he did in the other world anyway. He was a steward to Angus Og, and before he could even end his sentence, the great god of love, who he might tell a tale or two about to win favour with the Fianna at this time, Don rolled his eyes and scoffed. A steward, is it? Well, that's a lowly status for any man to have, isn't it? And a murmur of laughter rippled through some of the men who were listening. Well, Rock was not very well pleased by this, but then he put the question to Don. Now, seeing as your son is under a hill with me, and I've been caring for him for quite a while, you see, and Angus Og has kindly offered to foster your son, I was thinking maybe you might foster mine here, with the Fianna, to show him the ropes, as it were, of the mortal realm. I wouldn't want him to be at a disadvantage, you see. He looked into the cold eyes of Don, staring blankly back at Rock, who attempted to smile, but saw there was... Seeing as we had the affection of the same woman, I thought her taste was good, after all, when she chose me, so she might be well tasteful indeed if she'd found a man like you who would also foster her second son. The silence lingered. Awkwardly. Too long did it linger. And eventually Don spoke. No son of a steward has any place in the Fianna, and I'll not foster your son, steward. Go back under a hill. And with that, Rock turned. And downcast and angry he marched his way back, down to Brú na Báinne. And when he told Cruthnid of this, he was furious and shaking. He nearly cast a spell on the man there and then, but he had turned himself against acting in vengeance, for he had done nothing but cast words at him, and words were nothing. There was no need, no cause to make matters worse, but he was still pacing up and down, and Cruthnid was trying to calm him as the two boys were silently watching their father and foster father marching around and around, until Angus Og came up behind with a smile and a glint in his eye and said that he would foster both boys. After all, he was doing most of the foster fathering anyway. Rock was his steward, and these boys needed somebody to teach them the ways of the other world. And so it was that Angus Og took both the son of Don and the son of Rock, both children of Cruthnad, as his foster children. These two boys were a delight to him. Diarmuid was particularly a favourite of his, but Enda was trying his best, as young boys do. And there was plenty of chances to teach them in hunting, in racing, in dog running as well, and they loved nothing but to show how well they could hunt in the forests with the hounds. And it was no easy task to get them to come back from the forests after a day of running around. And they were getting longer and leaner. Although their appetites were growing, their voices were also growing, and they were great at talking. They were not very good at listening. But this is the way young boys will be. And Angus had endless patience with both of them, answered all of their questions, even the questions they'd asked again and again and forgotten the answer a few times, and even the questions they had rephrased to be answers and already answering their own questions and phrasing them again to make a point. Angus had an unwavering appreciation for the creative minds, and so left them and taught them to simply let go of all expectations and enjoy the heat of the chase and the wildness of the run through the forests. And so it wasn't long until Fionn McCool thought it was high time he visit his relative Cruthnad down under the hill in Brún na Bóinne, and he would take with him a retinue of the Fianna. Years had gone by at this stage, and he hadn't seen beautiful Diarmuid or the new baby boy that he had found she had given birth to as well. And so it was high time to celebrate the coming of summer, and when the Beothana fires were lit, the Vale was at its thinnest, and it was easy enough to gain access to the hill. And he called for Angus, and he was welcomed well. And so a great feast was had under hill. And at this stage, Don was with him. After all, he'd found out there was a feast and his son would be there. He wanted to see him, despite the fact that he had very little going on with his rearing. He had tried to see him from time to time, and he had. He'd come and he'd gone. But he hadn't stayed very long, and so at this stage it was a time for him to be welcomed in by Angus Og and meet the fairy host and see his son and see the other steward's son. There was still something in him that didn't like this boy being next to his. They were different. He shouldn't be an equal or seen as an equal. Birds flew overhead, crows cawed, and for a moment a dark thought crossed his mind. But he ignored it. Something just strange came over him. And they went down into the hill, and suddenly the lights lingered high into the caves above them, and there was more room underground than had been perceived from above. It looked like it was vast under hill. There was so much room when fairy hosts were coming, and Angus Og greeted them all warmly and kindly. A brilliant feast was laid out for all of the warriors, and afterwards Angus said they would have some games. The boys and the hounds would go off and chase and show some games and training that they were doing, so that at least Angus Og's fostering wouldn't become under scrutiny or any doubt for his minding of some of the Fianna's greatest warriors to be. Of course, Fionn had no worries, but some of the other men laughed at this, and Don glared to see his own son Diarmuid standing next to the steward's son, who was small and weak in comparison, light-limbed and fragile-looking, who was beaming up at his older half-brother. Don sighed, shaking his head, wondering what this all would mean if he had to care for that boy for the rest of his days. He tried to leave the thought go, but as the feasting went on, the drinking went down very easily, and every time the glass was refilled, he happily swirled it back, and before he knew it, he was spouting out words of ill repute towards any of those fae, those two-a-day, the trusted ones of these other crowd. You wouldn't trust them really though, could you? You can't trust these. And as he was being hushed and shushed by those around him, Angus Og brought them all upstairs, out of the hill, and now here they would go and see what was going on in the forests. For this was a game now. The hounds would be let off and the boys would run and chase, and maybe they'd catch a hare, but it was mostly for the amusement of the older ones there to see these young ones running around. And there were many sons and daughters of the Fianna and the fairy host in amongst the children running in through the forests, and the hounds were let off. And as they ran into a thicket, the Fianna followed. The sun was setting and darkness was falling as the shadows of the trees lingered long and limbed across the ground. Birds flew overhead. A crow called. Don noticed it. He noticed something stirring, moving, dogs darting off above and ahead. And as he walked towards the clearing, they nipped at one another, a tail, a shriek, a sharp turn, twist, and suddenly they were enrolled and rolling around one another, nipping and biting and snarling viciously, suddenly full fury taking over these two hounds as they ripped at one another, red in their teeth as they dug great bites out of one another, blood pouring, a scream, a dart, people moving around. Don noticed and felt this anger rise in him as something moved and ran between, and suddenly a scream pierced through. Someone had kicked the dogs. They yelped and scurried around, but people were in panic. People wondered what on earth had happened, and as the dust settled, fear and confusion spread through the people that were present there as they saw, in between where the dogs had been fighting, the body of a boy lying face down on the ground, blood spilling from his mouth. Rock's son. Rock ran to him and fell to his knees. He felt for his no heartbeat, no breath, nothing but a lifeless stare staring back at him. Rock cried out, "Whose dogs killed my boy?" He pointed his finger at Fionn. "The hounds of the Fianna are to pay for this." Fionn stepped forward, a grave look upon his face. He felt his feet in the soil and asked then for proof. "Find a tooth mark from the hound." Looking at the boy, he knew straight away those hounds didn't kill the boy, or he'd be scratched and torn up just the way those two hounds that were now skulking at the back and tails dipped down seemed to have blood pouring from them. This boy was not killed by one of those. Rock searched the boy's body but found no marking. He looked up in confusion and anger and dismay at Angus Og, who turned to look once more at Fionn. Fionn asked for a pail of water, some gold and a chessboard, and using his thumb, magically burnt on the salmon of knowledge, he began to trace the gold through the water and scatter it upon the chessboard. A ghostly vision came to his eyes, and he saw the truth. He saw what had happened only moments ago. In the flurry and panic, the boy had darted away from the hounds but managed to stumble and near fall into them and hastily flung himself in between the nearest adult's legs he could find. The thighs of Don had gripped him by his neck, and suddenly, harshly, quickly, twisted, snapping the boy's neck. Don had thrown the body into the chaos as the dogs were kicked apart and no one had seen. But now Fionn knew. He looked at Don, who simply stared in the ground. Crows cawed overhead once more. Fionn had no obligation to hide the truth from anyone, and so he stared Don down, his finger pointing. It was him. Rock flew into a rage. The steward of Angus Og threw back his head and called for vengeance. He took out his sword and looked around hurriedly till he found the face of Diarmuid, and stepping towards him, but then he saw Angus Og step in between, shaking his pale face side to side. Suddenly Rock knew vengeance would not be his, not yet. The anger in his hand as he held that sword began to shake as he threw it to the ground. But his hand went reaching for a hazel rod, and he cradled his only son's body in his arms, the pale, dark circles under his eyes, lifeless now. He spoke unknown words. His eyes rolled back in his own head, and Rock struck the boy's body with the hazel rod, and it twisted and turned. His skin darkened, and suddenly his mouth opened. Eyes were now wide with life, but he was twisting and convorting and transforming as teeth became great tusks. His nose came longer, his ears fell off his head completely, and now only skin transformed into a monstrous boar. He roared with hooves digging into the ground. No tail, no ears, but vicious, bright red, yellow and orange eyes staring down Diarmuid Ui Duibhne. He grunted and roared and ran into the forest, leaving everyone watch him. Rock declared that his son would never know feasting or love or longing from another one. He would roam the wild hills and feel only cold and be hunted. Rain and wind would be his only friend for so long, but he would be known as the Boar of Slieve Gullion, for this was his new form, and he would be cursed to be a furious avenger on the hills, and one day he would take Diarmuid's life. But he spoke again, that Diarmuid Ui Duibhne would have a geis on him from this day forward, never to be able to pierce the skin of a boar, or he would evoke doom. So when those two would meet again, Diarmuid would surely meet his fate, the same as his own son. Rock backed away into the forest. Fionn watched him leave. Diarmuid looked around between his foster father, the murderer of his own half-brother. His other foster father, for all intents, had gone now and doomed him to death. And he searched the faces of those standing around till he found his own mother, Cruthnit, standing near Fionn, but not close to him, isolated and on her own, staring at Don, her first lover, her first husband, the first father of her first child, Diarmuid, who stood wondering what was going through her mind, but knowing her heart was broken. Would Rock ever return to her? Or was their love now tainted so foully by this disastrous tragedy that love could no longer blossom between the two? Diarmuid was too young to know. His mother, Cruthnit, simply looked ashen and alone, marked by tragedy and jealousy. This ill fate, she may have blamed herself, but she now looked to Angus Og, the god of love, the one who would teach Diarmuid how to open up his heart when hers were so closed off and broken and far away from her, and now roaming around the hills of Benbulben. She knew her heart would always be in two places, in the wild countryside, roaming Ireland's shore, being beaten by the wind and the rain, and it would be in the halls with the Fianna, with Diarmuid Ui Duibhne, her beautiful son. She only hoped that Angus could teach Diarmuid how to keep love alive in his heart, for hers had truly died.